kia ora, New Zealand, and hello, world. You are listening to the Yeah Nah podcast, the official podcast of the New Zealand Skeptics. I'm Bronwyn Rideout, and with me are my usual co-hosts, Mark Honeychurch.
Hey.
And Katrina Borthwick. So, in this episode, Mark will divulge his most recent foray into creationism, as he recently had a skeptical excursion with a couple of our local skeptics to a talk offered by Creation Ministries International. I'm back in the Cultiverse this weekend to share some of my research into the Commonwealth Covenant Church, a now defunct Pentecostal group that made a bit of a splash in the 1940s and in many ways survived in the form of Hillsong Church as well as the Hope Center. We'll also have Katrina in the middle, who's going to tell us whether or not we should be ready to welcome our octopod overlords. So I guess maybe we want to do a bit of continuation of what we were talking about with the last podcast. Unless you've been living under a rock, you may have heard that someone has permanently moved into the Vatican this past week. There's a new pope in town, Robert Prevost, who is now Pope Leo the 14th. And I know Mark is kind of cringing or feeling his skin is crawling as we're talking about this, but kind of felt his election kind of came out of the blue a little bit. I know certainly from the social media side of things, this particular pope wasn't in the Pope Games, according to some TikTokers. And generally we would think his stances are, he has a stance for everyone. There's things about him that the progressives like, things about him that maybe the conservatives and moderates approve of more. Mark, you had a bit of a editorial about this. What are your thoughts?
It's a wait-and-see thing, isn't it? People have been dredging through a lot of historical stuff that the Pope has said on gay rights and other issues, and that doesn't look great, but there is a hope that maybe he's mellowed over time, especially given that he was fairly close to the previous Pope, who was relatively progressive. I did see that already, according to Andrew Copson, who is the head of Humanist UK, the Pope has already spoken out about how, being an atheist is not a good thing, and many of the world's ills are caused by a lack of faith, and that everybody needs to have a belief in some kind of higher power to make them behave, otherwise the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket. So, the usual kind of nonsense.
I mean, can we be surprised? He is the leader of millions upon millions of Catholics. They can't be conciliatory to everybody. There has to be somebody in the outgroup, and it has to normally be atheists, so maybe our feelings should not be heard on that account.
Yeah, I suppose it's okay to be a punching bag occasionally.
But I guess I've been thinking about Alessandra, one of our former members who passed a couple of years ago. I've been thinking about her a lot lately, particularly as I'm writing my thesis about neurodiversity. Every time Pope Leo is described as being the first American pope, I can hear her voice because she would get a little bit grumpy whenever people would talk about America, because of course the United States is a part of America, but it's not America in and of itself. So I think she would have had something to say, because obviously Pope Francis also came from South America. So in many ways, Pope Leo is not the first American. Alrighty, let's talk about Mark's recent trip to another Creationist meeting. Was this the same one that you went to earlier this year, late last year?
So this is a new speaker who I've never seen before. This guy was called Mike Collins, and like a lot of these talks, it was organized by Creation Ministries International. And Creation Ministries International are the group who run the website creation.com, which is one that gets a lot of flack, justifiably, because the website is full of ridiculous ideas and unscientific nonsense. This group might have got themselves into a rut, so they create Creation magazine. They produce that quarterly, and it's like a glossy, full-color magazine showing all the wonders of nature and why each of these wonders of nature points to the earth being young, about 6,000 years old, and points to a creator God. So this is something I've seen in pretty much every talk from this group, is a real push to sell subscriptions to the magazine. This group, basically, they seem to organize talks enough that I think probably for any given area of New Zealand, you'd be able to go to a Creationist talk a few times a year. Wellington, Christchurch and Auckland will see a little bit more than their fair share. But there's quite a few talks around, and most of them are organised by these guys, Creation Ministries International. I was checking my mailbox and I noticed there was another one of these going on. So myself, Tim and Richard. Tim is a long-time collaborator. We've done a lot of stuff together. But Richard, he's a grumpy old man. He'll come once in a while. I managed to drag him along to a Rise church once for an Easter service, and he was really not happy with it. He came along, and I think the most telling part of the event was at the very end of the evening when we stepped out of the church, and I'm going to swear here, so turn it down if you've got kids in the car. His first words were, "Well, that's the worst fucking evening I've spent in a long time." He really didn't enjoy the frustration of having to listen to bad science and not be able to say anything about it. That seemed to really rub him the wrong way, which was kind of fun to see in and of itself. I was sitting next to him, and there were a few exasperated murmurs. That's just not right, is it? And he just could not cope with listening to this torrent, I guess this gish gallop of creationist nonsense. So we had the hard sell, we had the please sign up to our mailing list, which I already am, and we had the please buy our Creation magazine. It's actually fairly cheap. I looked at the price and it's 100 New Zealand dollars for 3-year subscription. But I think, as I said, I think they've dug themselves into a hole where they have to do this. The talks and the selling of the magazine and the trying to convince people to subscribe. I get the feeling this might be how Creation Ministries International is still going. They have to keep selling to keep existing. And so I think these talks are just a vehicle to keep the organization alive. I have a suspicion that they are now dependent on selling subscriptions to the magazine and convincing people to donate, and getting out there into the churches and giving these talks is the best way that they can do it. So it's kind of almost like they're predatory on churches. I mean, they'll tell churches that they're trying to do the right thing by the church and help them be equipped to deal with evolutionists. But I wonder how much of this motivation is that money is just needed to keep the organization going. It seems like it really is a hard sell, and it looks like it's being pushed down from on high, that they can't do a talk and not mention subscription to the magazine. And the topic was how evolution hurts science and people. There are other talks that this guy Mike Collins gives that have different titles, but the content looks very similar. And also the content looked very similar to last year's Creationist speaker that we went to see. There were some pictures that looked identical. There were some topics that looked identical. The topics that he covered, it was mainly about the fossils and the flood. So he started talking about how fossilization and the kinds of fossils that we've seen, like an ichthyosaur mid-giving birth, surely this could only be caused by a sudden global flood, that the only way to get enough sediment to bury animals mid-birth would be a global flood. And that's just not true, right? We know that we're lucky that fossils are made at all. We know that most of the time that animals died, they rot and they're eaten and there is nothing left. We don't get anything. And just occasionally, we've been lucky enough that in history, animals do get buried, that maybe there is like a collapse of an underwater cliff and sediment suddenly buries something. Maybe an animal falls into a tar pit and suddenly gets all gummed up, and it's an environment without oxygen and without predators able to get to the dead body. So the fossils that we have, we're lucky that we even get those. But it's not a global flood, and the pattern of fossils doesn't follow a global flood. The places we see fossils don't suggest that they're all buried at the same time, and certainly don't suggest that it's 6,000 years old. That's one of the things that he tried talking about. Then he tried talking about radiocarbon dating. And this was the point that I focused on in my article for the newsletter. How one throwaway comment, there's so much behind it. It's that whole Gish Gallop thing. And for people who don't know what the Gish Gallop is, it was basically a tactic used by a creationist many years ago called Dwayne Gish. And Dwayne Gish, when doing a debate on creationism with someone who believed in evolution, he would throw out so many arguments so quickly. He would gallop through all these arguments, all these little one-liners about, well, evolution can't be true because of this, that it would take a scientist hours and hours and hours to unpack it. So it's kind of a debate tactic where one claim that's made without evidence might be 20 minutes alone, just to get people up to speed with the background and why the argument is wrong. And so a Gish Gallop is an effective rhetorical tool. It's just not really a very honest tool to be using, which is unsurprising for creationists. So this one throwaway sentence that he said about radiocarbon dating was that fossils have been radiocarbon dated, and that it's universally shown that they are less than the millions of years old that people are claiming. That, these fossils were not giving a date of 65, 70, 80, 100 million years. Amazing scientists have figured this stuff out. That's the dating that they've given us. That's the dating that we know and love, that the Earth is very old, and that fossils should be very old. Yet here's this guy in a church talking to a bunch of teenagers, explaining to them that radiocarbon dating disproves an old Earth because when fossils have been tested, it comes back with a fairly young date. So why is what he's saying absolute nonsense? I'll try to explain it here, but it's a hard topic. There's a lot of science there. Radiocarbon dating, there are limits to where it should be used, and that's a really important part of it. But what it's doing is it's measuring the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 inside something. Now, the reason why something would have carbon-12 and carbon-14 is because it's a carbon-based life form. So organic matter that has been living, it's either going to be a plant that's been breathing in from the atmosphere and sucking up carbon, or it's something that has been absorbing carbon from eating plants, or something that's been eating things that have been eating plants. But everything that's living should have carbon in it from the atmosphere, and a percentage of that will be an isotope of carbon called carbon-14, which has 2 extra neutrons in the nucleus. This isotope is unstable. It can hang around for a while, but carbon-14 wants to get rid of those 2 extra neutrons. And it does this through beta decay. So over time, a carbon atom that is carbon-14 will throw out electrons, and it goes to nitrogen-14. Throwing out the electrons turns a neutron into a proton. So it gains 2 protons and becomes nitrogen-14 instead of carbon-14. Over time, the amount of carbon-14 in a sample of organic matter will go down. If you knew what the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 is, and you see a ratio that's different to that, that ratio should be that there is less carbon-14, and the amount that ratio has changed will tell you how old that sample is because of radioactive half-lives. And one of the awesome things about radioactive half-lives is that they are constant. They are like a clock that can't be tampered with. So if you heat up something that has radioactive decay, it will not decay faster. If you put it under high pressure or low pressure, get it wet, or do anything else you can think of, you are not going to change how quickly it decays. This decay is a random thing, but statistically it happens at a certain rate. Basically what you'll find is that over a set amount of time, you can expect half of a sample to decay. Over the next set time, half of what's left will decay. And so we end up with what's called a half-life, which is the time it will take for half of a sample to decay. And because it's random, because this is not guaranteed, obviously the larger the sample size, the more reliable it is. If you get down to 1 atom or 10 atoms and you're watching those for decay, you will find that the randomness will start to be a large variable there, and you won't get a reliable half-life for just a few atoms. But what we're talking about with these samples is millions or billions of atoms, and when you've got that many, it turns out that this random decay becomes a very reliable measure. So the half-life for carbon-14 to go to nitrogen-14 is about 5,730 years. So every 5,730 years, half of the carbon-14 in an organic sample will decay to carbon-12. Over time, this means that the amount of carbon-14 left in a sample gets smaller and smaller. So the amount of carbon-14 that is considered to be accurately measurable is about 10 half-lives. So somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 years is the maximum time that it's considered that radiocarbon dating is useful for. So anything more than that, and the amount of carbon-14 that's left in a sample is small enough that you start to have problems measuring it. So that's the important part to know about radiocarbon dating, apart from the fact that this is a really cool bit of science, and this is something that we can reliably use to measure how old organic matter is once it's stopped ingesting carbon from the atmosphere, i.e. when it's died. The other thing to know is that it has that limit, and that limit is 60,000 years.
It's a really short period of time, isn't it? I mean, if we're looking at things like humans, about 3,000 years ago, we had sort of human-like things. And I mean, the dinosaurs are extinct 65 million years ago, I think. So it's useless for looking at those real prehistory kind of things, isn't it? Just no use.
Yeah. It's got a very specific timeline for which it is useful, and it is a lot of civilization, which makes it useful for a lot of archaeology. And it's cool for things like the Turin Shroud as well. You know, anything that's been made from organic matter, you can test and get a fairly reliable answer back. But it has that limit, and the trouble when you go beyond that limit is, as far as I understand, and I've heard this several times, a lab, rather than just come back to you and say, we measured so little carbon-14 that we can't give you a result. Normally, they'll give you a tentative result, a number of about the limit, 50,000 or 60,000. But obviously, they can't go any further than that. So if you put a really old sample in, and creationists have not just done this with fossil, they've also done it with diamond, because diamonds are carbon. They get this number of 50 or 60,000 years, and they go, hey, look, this isn't as old as people have been saying. But the number that they've got, this 60,000 years, is not the true age. That's just the limit of how far radiocarbon dating can go back. And the other huge thing with this that's really important to know is that fossils generally are not made of the matter that the animal was made of. They are not the same carbon-based things that were inside the animal, with some exceptions for some hard stuff like bone. You can have some surviving. And there is another example of soft tissue that looks like it's probably surviving a long time, which we might get onto. But mostly what happens is, after the animal's died and it gets buried in sediment and it's encased and it's entombed, over time, minerals will solidify in those places where this soft creature was. And so mineralization, where liquid with minerals in goes through and deposits these minerals, that replaces where the creature was, where the plant was that was buried, and it kind of leaves this positive imprint. So it's like the animal dies, sediment goes round it, and it kind of makes like a mold, and then that mold gets filled with new rock. Like mineral rock will basically form in those spaces. And depending on the circumstances, sometimes that can pick up really fine-grained detail for fossils. It can pick up scales and things like this, which is really awesome, but it is rare for there to be any kind of original material left. So the material that's being sent away from fossils to be tested is not the remains of the animal. It is minerals that have replaced the animal's body over millions of years. And so what you're testing is a rock. You're testing nothing that has carbon in it. And so you're always going to get this result back of 50,000 years, 60,000 years, which is the limit of radiocarbon dating. They're getting a date back which is actually incompatible with their theory. Their theory is 6,000 years old for the Earth. 4,500 years ago, Noah's flood happened. Dinosaurs got to hang around with humans for a bit longer than that. And then eventually they died out. They were hunted by humans, etc., etc. So dinosaurs might have lived until about 4,000 years ago. But the dates they're getting back for this radiocarbon dating will be 50,000, 60,000 years. So yes, it's younger than the scientists are saying, and for very good reason, but it doesn't align with their theory. It's not coming back like 4,000 years, 5,000 years ago, these samples. It's coming back with a much older date. So the whole thing is messed up. And then to just give the audience a sentence or two saying, oh, we've sent fossils off for radiocarbon dating, and they prove that dinosaurs weren't roaming around millions of years ago because the dates we get back are earlier than that. It's total nonsense from beginning to end. But, I mean, I've described it badly, and I've taken 15 minutes to do it, and then you've just got to have this whole spiel just to try and undo the bad information that someone's been given. And it's really unfortunate that this audience is, I guess, captive, I presume, because it was mainly teenagers. I presume their parents told them they needed to be at this talk.
Or was it a youth group thing?
I don't know. It was like a Sunday evening, so I figured it would be their normal evening service. But then they had this talk instead, and I was expecting it to be older people, but it was mainly kids.
Just you, the older people. Do you think because at some point he's got this theory, someone's going to say, hey, that's not right. And then I guarantee you, if you do a Google search on how accurate, it's going to come up as like your first hit that this is not right and that you can't date things. How would he not know that's wrong?
I think for people like this, it's motivated reasoning. Mike Collins will not go out and Google these things. Mike Collins will consume the articles on Creation Ministries International's website. And I think that he will be sent updates, new science, and they'll have this mailing list, I'd imagine, for the speakers that gives them new talking points. So there is probably quite a tight control, but he will have his own motivations. He wants to spread the word of God. So he will feel like he doesn't even want to go and look at those secular resources because they're all lying to him. It's the devil trying to trick him, no doubt. That is scarily all too often something that people will say is not just that metaphorical devil, but actually there is a devil trying to trick Christians into believing in an old earth and other things. So I think he's protecting himself by just consuming the materials of the group that he's giving talks for. And I don't know, but I suspect this might be his career now that he's not fixing aircraft, which was his day job years ago. I think probably his income comes from giving these talks.
It's interesting how people who believe in God and think he's all powerful also make the devil this incredibly powerful thing that can upend your life if you use Google or actually read anything that's wrong. And it doesn't make any sense. It's sort of pick your side. But do you believe more in an all-powerful God, or are you believing more in an all-powerful devil that can corrupt you? If you look at it sideways, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, it's a very old story that modern Christians find themselves having to go along with to an extent, but the evangelical Christians, the biblical literalists, they're embracing it. They're showing how much they believe by believing in these things quite literally.
I'm interested in the theory that you just put out, Mark, that the speaker is making enough for a living wage to give up aircraft repair. I'd say he was probably making buco bucks.
Yeah, I can't imagine he's making a lot. So I imagine his aircraft maintenance engineer career came to an end, and he's old, and most of these speakers are old. They'd be in their 60s, I'd say. And so I think this is a way to both help the church and make some money. And you're right that there's probably not a lot of money to be made in it. But at the same time, these places, they do, as well as the sign up for Creation magazine,
they're doing the love offerings as well.
Exactly. They're running around and they're doing the offering where they say, we'll just have an offering for the speaker tonight. And so everything that goes in the bucket for that donation will go straight into his pocket. And he may or may not declare it for tax purposes. I think it's tempting for these people running the religious circuit to not declare it. So they do have these offerings, and sometimes these offerings might come back with like $5, but I imagine sometimes you could walk out of a place with $100, $200 without any problems. It's not a lot, but he's doing maybe 3 or 4 of these talks a week when he's on a roll.
What's the harm that he's saying this is causing?
So the harms, well, yes. Why is it bad to believe in evolution? Basically because he brought up a graph that was too zoomed out for us to see anything about it, but it had a rising line and a falling line. The falling line was belief in religion or creationism or attendance at church or something like that. And the line that went up, he threw a few things out, that abortions are going up, that euthanasia is becoming more popular, and also that there is an increase in divorce, there's an increase in rape, and an increase in youth suicide. And the less that people believe in creationism, the more we're seeing these things increasing. He also had a historical warning that Hitler was inspired by evolution to kill millions of people.
Oh, I had to bring him into it.
Yeah, and also he just threw out there that evolution is racist as well. Because Darwin and other people were racist, which they absolutely were. That was just how people were back then, which is not to excuse it at all. But yeah, Religious people were racist back then. Darwin was racist back then. Most people were racist back then in the Western world. But that doesn't mean evolution is racist.
I don't understand the connection there, and I'm sure the CMI church has nothing to do with any kind of ists at all.
I wonder if you're looking back at the connection between Darwinism and that long train to eugenics.
Yeah, it is the survival of the fittest, and are certain races fitter than the other? Hitler figured that the white race was fit to survive and the others weren't, and he could just help it along a little bit. So yes, there are inferior races and there are superior races. As far as this guy is concerned, the church doesn't do that. It's never treated black people badly. It's always been perfectly accepting of everybody.
Perfectly accepting of their money.
Well, I suppose that has overridden things recently, but yes, the church has a long history of being very racist and overtly having rules about black preachers and not being allowed to have certain positions within the church. It's very much been a large part of the history of the Christian church.
Yes.
So yes, the highlight of the evening, they had a trilobite fossil, and they passed that round, and it's actual science. And I mean, he ruined it. He ruined it by saying that this fossil will have been very likely buried in the global flood of Noah's time, which was just stupid. But the fossil, ignoring everything that was coming out of his mouth, just seeing the trilobite fossil, it's a really good example of a trilobite, and it was really nice to see.
Was it a real fossil or was it a mold?
Yeah, I don't know. It looked so good. I was a little bit skeptical about whether it was just a copy.
Did it come from a Christian creationist education wholesaler?
Don't ruin it for me. I am going to continue to believe that I saw a real trilobite fossil. But yeah, I did have my suspicions at the time, and I pushed them to the back of my head because I didn't want to think about them and I wanted to believe.
Maybe while Katrina's talking about octopods, you can take a look and see if that picture of your trilobite actually comes up on Alibaba.
Oh my God. If I find hundreds of them that look identical to that, I am going to be crestfallen.
And we can all have one.
We can give them away at the conference.
Stop it. This is a one-of-a-kind amazing thing that I saw.
I don't think we want this guy as our wildcard speaker, though. It doesn't sound like he was particularly inspiring.
Yeah, this is good, right? The one thing that was kind of good about the talk was he was so monotone and so boring, and he used so many long words that the teenage audience, I think, just phased out really quickly. He did not connect with the audience, and his message will not have found fertile ground. Most creationist speakers are good at what they do. They have a little bit of personality. This one didn't. I was finding it boring, and I can sit through a lot. I mean, I've sat through, 10, 12 hours of David Icke, and I was having trouble staying focused with this one.
Well done.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Our commiserations with Richard.
I don't think I'm going to convince him to come to another event for the next 10 years. I think he's been burned, and it's going to take a long time for him to heal.
Well,
I hope you at least
took him out for beer afterwards.
We went straight to the pub afterwards, and I paid for his beer to apologise.
You'll be paying for his beer for a while.
Oh, God, no, don't say that. No. One beer was payment for a bad evening.
It's not like he listens to the podcast, so it's not like he's going to hold you to the promise.
I don't know, but he's reading the newsletter now, so he's engaging with us in some way.
Alrighty, well, moving on. Katrina, tell us, are we going to have Octopus as our next Prime Minister?
I think this all answer is yes, so that's me finished, isn't it?
Congratulations. Now I'm going to talk about the Commonwealth Covenant of Church.
I know those who listen to the podcast, we had this brief interaction, didn't we, Mark, about someone mentioned octopuses, and I got a bit excited. And it is an area I have been monitoring and reading about. They excite me, and there has been research into octopodes, octopi, octopuses. They've got all these different names. None of those are incorrect. I guess the angle I'm coming from is that I'm really interested in the nature of consciousness and why people come to think. One way of understanding why humans think the way they do is starting to think about, well, if there was an alien civilization, how might that evolve, and what might be the common things that we might see in intelligent life in the universe? And so it makes sense to look at the most alien life that we have on Earth, and I guess octopi. They've evolved their intelligence and their bodies up through a completely different evolutionary pathway. So We are vertebrates. Octopuses are cephalopods, and I think the other one is arthropods, like beetles and insects and spiders with their skeleton on the outside. We start to see some solutions that are similar. So eyes, for example. Octopuses have eyes, but their eyes didn't evolve along the same pathway as ours, but you can see it sort of come up with the same solution. They've got openings that can close in their head, and they can see out of those, kind of
But
have things like...
Apparently better designed in a way. I think it feeds blood from the back rather than the front, so the blood vessels are less of a problem for octopus eyes.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, and so I guess, we're getting the same thing, and I guess when animals evolve, it tends to start off with some light-sensitive cells on your skin. That might be the start of what might ultimately turn into eyes once a creature, evolves a little bit more. And so similar solution for the same problem, but it's been developed through what we call convergent evolution. So it's basically saying you get to the similar solution through a different pathway. But in other regards, we see completely different solutions. Yes, octopi have hearts, but they have 3 hearts and 9 brains. So you don't really see anything else with 9 brains on Earth. The book that I found really interesting that got me excited about this was a book by Peter Godfrey Smith. So it dates back about 9 years, 2016, and it's called Other Minds, The Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness. So this is right on the money in terms of the things I'm interested in. It's looking at octopuses and how they think. And he said that the minds of cephalopods are the most other of all. And so cephalopods are octopuses, cuttlefish, and squid. Another hook that got me in was Radiolab, which is a really cool podcast series, and they pick a really random topic each time. And quite often it sounds like something really boring, but when you listen to it, it's really exciting. This one's called Octomum, and it follows a single female octopus who is sitting on her eggs at the bottom of the deep sea for 4.5 years. And she just sits. I know that sounds really boring, but it isn't. It's got a bit of drama. It turns out octopi can sort of hibernate a little bit, like a bear or whatever, and then sit there. So she didn't eat. She's just sitting down there for 4.5 years on her eggs. And if some crabs come along and want to eat her babies, she will defend that and then just kind of go back into kind of a coma.
Okay, so it's like a minimal energy burn. But then I guess if a crab comes to attack, and if you can kill the crab, presumably you've got some calorific input as well.
Yeah, there was sort of shells and things left, so something was happening. But she wasn't looking very well. They'd go and check on her, and she was looking worse and worse. But she made it, and then at the end she was gone. They don't know what happened, but the babies also were hatched. So that was really interesting. According to a recent claim by Tim Coulson from the University of Oxford, he thinks that if humanity is wiped out, octopi could take over the Earth. And this is because they've got advanced thinking, they use tools, and they've got the ability to adapt to their environment. So if the environment changes, humans aren't there, they might be really well placed to take over the Earth. I do think humans existing in our current form and in current state of civilization are a pretty big barrier to emerging. But if something happened to us, we wipe ourselves out, something like that, then we've got these ocean dwellers who may survive because they're in the ocean, and they could emerge as the next technological. They've got a few interesting biology things going on, and one is in their genes and another is in their 9 brains. In their genome, they've got something called transposons. These are short sequences of, sometimes they're called jumping genes. So what they can do is they can take a piece of DNA, copy it and paste it somewhere else, or even maybe move it, like they cut, copy, paste it somewhere else. And that enables evolution, basically. So you can change the genome over time if you've got transposons in there. And there's one kind of transposon that is really important for learning in humans, and it appears to still be active in octopi as well. And we are seeing behaviours from octopi which show they've got behavioural and neural plasticity. So that means that they can use their brain for different things depending on the environment. So when you hear about people that can't see, but they can kind of see with sonar, if you know what I mean, they've repurposed their brain so that they can use sound to have some kind of vision. That is neural plasticity. When people adapt to various kinds of things like cochlear implants, for example, that's called neural plasticity, to using your brain in a different way and adapting. So that is really important in learning and adapting and solving problems, and I guess is a good foundation for intelligence. So octopuses can solve puzzles and tie knot, open toddler-proof cases, which I'm really impressed with because I have trouble opening those things. Squirt water at humans they don't like across the room, and escape from aquariums. There was actually a research centre, I think it was in the South Island, and they had an octopus in there, and there was a particular feature that the octopus didn't like, and it was squirt her every time she came in. Every time this octopus saw this person, they would get water at the back of their necks. So they can recognise people as well. They can tell the difference between different humans. There was also a octopus called Inky that escaped from Napier Aquarium, and octopi can actually survive about 30 minutes out of water, so they don't need to stay submerged the whole time. This one crawled down a pipe or something and got back out to the sea. And also sometimes they crawl out of their tank across the floor of the aquarium and into another tank and eat the fish there, and then crawl back, hide in their tank again. The aquarium keepers wonder where all their fish have gone. And it's this octopus has actually been snacking on their neighbours, basically.
Oh, sneaky.
They're sneaky and clever, cheeky. They can use tools, so, taking things like coconut shells to build a little shelter, using weapons. So they have been observed before holding man or jellyfish tentacles to defend themselves or capture prey and sting other animals with these tentacles. And this is in the wild. And also we've got a few in captivity using Lego bricks to kind of block up their lairs. And they really love playing with Lego. And there's just too many videos of playing with Lego on the internet. And I had to stop myself because I was just watching videos of octopi. So there you go.
I'm going to have to go straight to my computer after recording this and watch some.
Yeah. And I found a really cool video of octopus called sashimi. I don't think it's a good name for an octopus because it sounds a little bit like you might be going to eat it. But anyway, it's a cute octopus, and they 3D printed this colourful maze for it, and it goes through, and it's really clever, and it's trying to work its way through. But the weird thing it does, you can see its arms moving while it's unscrewing something, but it's staring right at you. The reason why an octopus can do that and have its arms doing something while it's still looking at you is because of its brain structure. Most of the neurons are not in the central brain like we have. So we have a body map that we control directly with our head. So if we want to move our hand, we think we want to move our hand, and there it goes. Our hand moves. With an octopus, 60% of their brain and neurons are in their tentacles. 10% is in their central brain, and then they've got 2 optic lobes which take up the rest. So all their brain does is basically just trigger a behavioural response. So it just says, something over there you might need to look at and do something with, and then sends that signal to the tentacles, and they flail around and then they do what they need to do. And the central brain doesn't really need to know anymore. It just kind of sends that signal down. Octopus sends the signal, it starts unscrewing the thing. At this point, the central brain's disconnected, and now it's looking at you doing something completely different while its arm's way over here doing something else. So I think it's a really interesting way to have your brain wired.
Yeah.
It kind of makes sense because octopus is entirely flexible. So if you think about a human arm, there's only a limited number of movements your arm can do. If you try to do anything else, you'll probably hurt yourself. You've got, wrists, elbows, shoulders, but nothing really in between there. Got a few more things going on in your hands. Very limited. So we can control all of this with our brain without overloading. But if you're an octopus, there are no bones. So you can move absolutely everything in every different direction. And you can also taste and feel with the limbs. So I don't actually think a human brain could have the complex movements of an octopus body. I don't think it would be possible for a human to have an octopus body with the central control like we do. Our brain is not designed to drive 8 arms that are entirely flexible. So what this comes to is they actually might be a little bit better designed than we are in terms of manipulating objects and those sorts of things. So they have become an inspiration for more flexible robots. So if we're going to build a robot, it might not make sense to build a robot like a vertebrate, like a dog or a human on 2 feet. I mean, how hard is that? You're on an uneven surface and you're trying to balance on 2 feet. Why would you do that? So it might be a really smart thing to have a body based on something like an octopus so that you can just redistribute your weight whenever you like. And, if you come across a rocky bit, it doesn't really matter. You just kind of move around it.
As long as this thing is not operating anywhere near humans who are going to be very freaked out by a robot octopus coming towards them.
Yeah, they look a bit scary. So I guess if you are familiar with the works of H.P. Lovecraft, there's definitely a whole lot of octo-intelligence-inspired work in there. Some of the covers art for, Call of the Cthulhu and stuff like that. It's definite octopus references, so scary stuff. But also the pie, there's like little kids' toys and stuffed toys. My kids have got some octopuses and things like that. As soon as you start sticking suckers and stuff on things, it gets a bit scarier, but if you make it kind of fluffy and furry with a smiley face, maybe not so bad, but...
And presumably for a robot octopus, those suckers would be useful as well?
Yeah, I think so. Especially if you start putting sensory kind of things in them. So if you've got something that's really flexible, that's got maximum sort of sensors on it, that seems like if you were trying to learn things and do science, that would be a really cool tool to have. But of course, then you've got to get a robot to control it. And central control probably might not be the way to go again. So, well, do you design an AI octopus brain or not? The interesting sci-fi book I was reading, and it's called Children of Memory by Adrian Tchaikovsky. There's a spoiler coming, so if you're about to read this book, skip over. But in that, there are a number of people on a ship, and they kind of lose their memory and get dumped into a virtual world. And a lot of them are humanoids, but one of them is a cephalopod, basically an intelligent octopus. And they get put into this virtual world as humans. And so the sci-fi writer, he's thinking about, well, how do I translate an octopus kind of creature into human? And so what you get in that story is this disconnected, really disorganized parent human that, like, he's painting around messily and art all the time, but you can't really get a straight answer out of him, and he doesn't talk very well. And then there's these 8 children, and they're quite serious, and they kind of run around and do what needs to be done and doing things. And I'm like, well, that's a really great way of thinking about it, in terms of, the octopus is the central brain, but they're not really the serious thinker in the story here. They're just kind of directing things and hoping for the best. And the children, the tentacles, are the ones that are sort of going off and doing the things. They've also found some sort of octopus cities, maximum sort of 15 occupy, and there's sort of these shells that pile up time after time, and they've got octopus living in there. And one of them is called Octopus, and this is of Jervis Bay in Australia, and nearby there's another one that's called Octopus. But I guess the biggest limitation on world domination for octopi is their short life. So I think, being in the sea doesn't mean they can't become a technological civilization. They might learn to go onto land using scuba gear or whatever. But they only really live normally about 1.5 years, which is incredibly short. There are some Southern Ocean ones, even around New Zealand, that live around 4.5 years. So Octomum was one of those. She was brooding her children for that long. But that short lifespan also means that they can evolve and adapt a lot quicker. So where you get one human generation, you might have 15 octopi generations. So I guess they are quite well positioned to take over the earth should human race get out of the way. And if they do, it's highly likely that it might happen around New Zealand shores where we've got the slightly longer lived octopi. So we could be ground zero for the next wave of intelligence on Earth.
So everyone putting in OIA requests wondering if John Key's a lizard have gotten it wrong. The question we should be asking is John Key an octopus, or was he an octopus?
I think that would be more concerning, wouldn't it?
And that's really fitting, actually, given you were talking about Octomum, the podcast. There is a game called Octodad where there is an octopus pretending to be a father. The game's really good fun because it's multiple players and you each control like a couple of limbs, and it's just a mess. You throw things all over the place. It's a nightmare to play.
I wouldn't say he's pretending to be a father. He's absolutely the dad to those kids. He's just pretending to be a human. And he's fooling nobody.
But yeah, it's really good. Like that multiplayer games where you have to independently control parts of a character, they do generally end up being mayhem. As you say, our single brain is not good for controlling that many limbs.
Yeah, I think it's hard to get your head around, isn't it? I can barely think about writing with my left hand, let alone having 8 arms.
Thank you for that, Katrina. And I guess we're on to the final segment of the night, bit of a short one. So, Mark, in your editorial, you had mentioned that you were familiar with Smith's Wigglesworth. Do you want to indulge me into how you already know about?
I'm not sure how I know about Wigglesworth. Whenever I first read the name, it tickled me so much. It's such a cute name.
For uncute things.
I can't remember the context in which I first heard about him, but I've heard about him maybe 2 or 3 times in the past. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's always just the name that sticks. Smith Wigglesworth is such a cute name.
Well, this weekend with the newsletter, I wrote about the Commonwealth Convent Church. I've been thinking about writing about this group because a couple of months ago, or actually more than a few months ago now, I was asked about were there any other cults or sects in the Wairarapa Hutt Valley. And I knew about the 2x2s, the Dutch Reformists, and I'm up for a challenge. I'm up for the game of it. And I came across this group, but they had a particular history in the Hutt. What made it difficult is that there isn't a lot of documentary evidence. There's obviously some articles that I pulled up from papers past, but not too many pictures. I think the Hope Center probably has quite a few archives of the church, because that's what this Commonwealth Covenant Church became, or they sort of merged into in like the 90s, early 2000s. But yeah, just not a lot of websites. I mean, they had their heyday in the 1930s and 1940s, and then kind of gradually faded out into obscurity. Became a very, very secretive sect in many ways, as I said before, becoming defunct. I think by about 2013, according to census numbers, they only had maybe about 6 people. And even by the 1960s, they were in the couple of hundreds. So what are the Commonwealth Covenant Church? Basically, they are a long-dead Pentecostal church. Now, where Smith Wigglesworth comes in is that he was a Yorkshire pastor, a born-again Christian who only apparently learned to read once he married his wife, and he learned to read using the Bible, and the legend goes that was the only book he would let into his house. That was the only reading material he let his family have. He kind of got his start in preaching in about 1907 after getting baptized during a revival. And he became very well known for faith healing and practicing the laying on of hands, doing anointing of oils. And one time, I'm not sure if he went to Sweden or Norway or Switzerland. He went to one of the Nordic countries, and he wasn't allowed to do the laying of hands. So what he had everyone do was lay their own hands upon themselves as part of the healing.
That's an interesting way of doing it.
Yeah.
I've seen a laying on of hands before where you don't touch someone, you just hover your hands over them, but laying on of hands on yourself is the novel approach.
Yeah. But he did it all. He did it all. Now, he came to New Zealand about 2 or 3 times in the 1920s, and it's a weird story because everyone's like, oh, he just showed up and no one knew who he was. But he did have some renown as a pastor in the UK, in Europe, so I think someone knew because he had a driver, he had hosts when he came to Wellington. And basically, his visit in the 1920s kind of kicked off the Pentecostal revival in New Zealand.
Right.
Today, particularly from the work of Wigglesworth, or certainly around the time of that revival. He's credited as being inspirational to the founding of churches such as the Assemblies of God, which is Ray Comfort's church, or was Ray Comfort's church back in the day. It's a very well-known, very controversial church as well. Elim Church, which had its start in Wales. And I think there was a couple of other churches, including the Commonwealth Covenant Church. So kind of very influential to the Pentecostal revival circuit that we have. There's a couple of famous stories, like he was such a man of God that during a prayer meeting, he had all these leaders come in from different churches, and just the light and glory of God was so intense that all these other preachers had to leave the room because of the heat and the light, and only he could tolerate it.
Oh my God.
While he was visiting New Zealand, Wigglesworth had a chauffeur whose name was Francis Robert Wilson. And Francis Wilson was just so inspired that he would go on to build up his own skills in evangelical Pentecostal revival and become involved with a church called the British Israel Church. I did a little bit of a series about the full gospel mission out in Christchurch that kind of made news back in the 70s and 80s. It's also known as Camp David. They were also a British Israel church. In brief, basically, British Israelism is kind of a pseudo-historical belief system in which Anglo-Britons, United Kingdom, they are the direct descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And in particular, the royal family are direct inheritors descended from the throne of King David. And very much in the 1800s, 1900s, Israelism was very much attached to a lot of pseudo-archaeological beliefs, particularly like pyramidology, Bible prophecy, that the pyramids of Giza had a very particular significance for the British. And basically, this has sort of all been distilled down as, maybe being a little bit racist, just a little. And this is like the second time I've been doing a semi-religious cult topic and somehow find out that there's a Kiwi out there pushing out some pretty racist stuff. So in this case, a former University of Canterbury grad named A.J. Ferris, who had a BA in Arts and Education diploma, and he got involved in the church around the same time as Francis Wilson. And yeah, he just started putting out all these pamphlets about British Israelism in about the 1940s and World War II. Like, he's noted in the Wikipedia for British Israelism as being a prominent publisher. But anyways, as I said, A.J. Ferris was active in the British Israeli Church at the same time as Frank Wilson. The congregation of this church was never really big, but it did grow. Like, they had churches in major centers. But again, after a while, I think around the time of the war, A.J. Ferris left New Zealand, went over to the UK, and at some point, Frank Wilson takes control. They keep the name of the British Israeli Church until about 1939, and for whatever reason, a notice went out in the paper saying, oh, just to not cause confusion or upset with our brethren in the World British Israeli Federation, we're going to change our name from the British Israeli Church to the Commonwealth Covenant Church. Nonetheless, from what we see from these early adverts, the general tone of their meetings haven't really changed. They're very much pushing Bible prophecy, still like standard Pentecostal stuff. They believe very much in the speaking of tongues, abstaining from addiction and gambling, the authority of the Bible, and that humans essentially inherit their sinful nature from birth. They very much believe that the return of Jesus Christ was imminent, and they were really expected to practice self-denial in daily life. And that's going to be something that's going to become relevant in a couple of minutes. Church meetings were held on Sunday as well as Tuesday and Thursday evenings. While they took advantage of statutory holidays, they didn't really esteem one day as special over the other. So when you had holidays like Christmas, those were times for acts of charity for other people. So for the first couple of years, really doesn't appear that they have courted much controversy, but every now and then there was articles about a member of the Commonwealth Covenant Church, particularly the younger men, like the 18-year-olds, who would come up to the Wellington Manpower Committee. This was the committee that you would take your appeal to if you did not want to be conscripted into the military. maybe one every couple of years, for various reasons, like, oh, hey, I'm going into the ministry, and so on. So there's little cases like that, but I think probably where the whole story starts getting grim is in about 1943, and that's where we start getting the child abuse cases. There was one that got brought up in 2016 in which Eric David Wilson, who was Frank Wilson's brother, was visiting another church member and pushed this church member to physically discipline his 7-year-old daughter. The injuries of this child were pronounced enough that they kept the kid out of school for 10 days. It was a switching. We would probably want to see this sort of response now, in a sense, from the court. But they're basically like, look, the dad seems that he's sorry. He says that he wouldn't have done it if it wasn't for the minister. So the dad got probation and the minister got 6 weeks in jail.
That does sound like the kind of thing that probably wouldn't happen these days.
But yeah, one of the things that Eric Wilson, that minister, was saying is that he certainly believed very thoroughly that he would literally see the devils flee from the bodies of children if they were beaten, and that, there was a difference between disciplining a child out of love versus, say, disciplining a child out of temper. And the judge wasn't having anything of that. But I guess it was something of a reflection of the time, because the judge made this comment that we don't flog girls, and if she wasn't a girl, you only flog 7-year-olds so many times. You have to consider their gender, their weight, their physical disposition. So there was actually a bit of a checklist that you had to go through if you were going to flog a child at that time. So on one hand, it was still parents have a right to discipline their child. But the judge was saying, it's lawful, but it was too severe and inappropriate. Right. So that was one case. A little while after, there was another case in Nelson, similar case. But the father in that case just got a fine of £10. But in that instance, the father was acting on his own volition, and he was just disciplining his child, and he happened to be a member of this church. He wasn't being pushed to it by the ministers. But at the same time, what is the underlying doctrine about child discipline that this church had? We also have an incident of faith healing that gone awry. In 1947, a 23-month-old child died in the Lower Hutt due to laryngeal diphtheria. The child had been unwell for quite a while, and despite the grandfather trying to encourage the father to go and take this kid to see a doctor, instead, Francis Wilson was brought in to pray over the child, and the child eventually died. And the coronial inquest said any skilled physician would have diagnosed diphtheria, and this child would have had a good outcome.
So totally preventable.
One really interesting case happened in 1948, and it's kind of gross, and you'll understand why. A former member of the church, Lawrence Bailey, comes to the Supreme Court to petition the restitution of conjugal rights by his wife, Phyllis. The couple had attended the Commonwealth Covenant Church for 13 years in Lower Hutt, and Phyllis had really bought in. She wanted to live up to the standards of Frank's sermons. She goes to court, leaves the family, leaves the kids with the husband, accuses her husband of physical and sexual assault, having abnormal desires, and threatening to kill her. And also saying that the kids were subject to physical abuse, and one of her children had even left home because of it. Lawrence denies any of those charges, and there's nothing in papers passed in which any testimony from this older son or from anyone supports anything that Phyllis says. But also, we don't see anyone who's sort of corroborating anything that Lawrence says either. But the allegations that Lawrence makes against Frank Wilson are really interesting. In one instance, he says Frank Wilson badgered him to sell his house, his car, and other personal belongings estimated to be about £7,000, and to give all the proceeds, including Phyllis's fur coat, onto the altar as offerings to the church.
It sounds very Destiny Church, doesn't it?
And then because Lawrence was a carpenter, he also demanded that Lawrence quit his carpentry job and work for the ministry instead at a rate of £3 a day, which probably would have been far less than what he would have been making at the time. And there's a really interesting implied unseemliness in what's happening in the church through this quote. He thought it was his wife's duty to return to him on the earlier basis, which included marital relations. He denied ever forcing such relations upon her. Sometimes, when his wife was not feeling well, she retired to the back room of the church with Brother Frank to be prayed for by him.
What?
That's like, ooh, what are you saying there? But the court ruled in Lawrence's favor. This is the gross part, because I'm going to give you some more things about how culty they kind of were and their behavior. No matter how culty this church is, this is a woman who does not want to go back to her husband. And here she is being ordered by the court to return to her husband within 3 months to resume, and what they expect, court ordered to resume marital relations, conjugal relations.
How did that go?
And the time frame which the judge thought would enable Phyllis to carefully consider her prospect of comfort and security with her husband. versus the unpredictability of relying on the congregation.
Oh my
Wow.
goodness.
The judge said he judged this way because he thought Lawrence was sincere and that Phyllis was under the influence of the church, because basically she was probably being whipped up into a fervor by the congregation because they would have these open confessions where people would go up and openly confess about their aberrant sexual behavior. So she was probably becoming influenced. And that could be true. But also, she's being court ordered to go to a home she doesn't want to go to.
So this story, it's ticking so much of the cult boxes that we know exist about high control and manipulation and some grubby man using the power he has over others to get everything he wants. People working for cheap or free, people selling their houses and giving them the money, women having sex with him, like that.
We presume.
Okay, so
but
there's a euphemism there that sounds very much like something other than prayer is going on in the back room.
But even further, in a couple of other articles, particularly ones that came out later on the case, there's a really interesting picture that starts to form. But he was planning to go to the police. He was threatened with cancer and death by the church if he continued with his petition to get Phyllis back. When he was still attending services, he said he was required to be at the church building between 9 to 11 times a week. Each time there's about 250 to 700 people attending meetings. I don't know how inflated that is because I haven't really been able to get my hands on any records. And he speaks about sometimes there was people who were full-time 24-hour prayer warriors. He speaks about coming into this disorienting atmosphere for Saturday night meetings. There's about 300 to 400 sweaty people in the same room, and they're singing the same hymn 20 to 30 times. And he's like, you can hear them down the road, and it can be really disorienting. And he said one time he had a 10-shilling donation and a 50-pound note, and he was so out of it that he ended up giving the note rather than the 10 shillings, and he couldn't get it back. And he's like,
a trance, like,
yeah.
You know when you do that drumming around the fire and you're into kind of a weird zone.
And it's interesting to hear this happening in the late 40s. And yeah, Lawrence was like, this is likely how Wilson was able to collect about $28,000.
It'll be that emotional manipulation. I mean, you see it in churches today where a church that knows what it's doing, they'll have someone sneak up onto stage, get behind the keyboard, and start playing some very emotional music just to rouse people and get them into that mindset as the plea is happening. Give as much as you can. Make it a regular donation. Every dollar you spend is an investment in your future and that kind of thing.
There's a playbook. And again, Lawrence also said, due to Frank and the sort of advice that he gave, he was putting out sermons about the potential necessity of separating husbands and wives. They're suspecting that quite a few families in the Hutt had been broken up due to Wilson's interference. Now, while that whole court case was going on, Lawrence also talks about a particularly derogatory statement made by Frank Wilson against the Army. It seems that Lawrence might have been sick at the military camp, and Wilson and Phyllis got Lawrence out, and Wilson had asked Lawrence to come to church, wear your uniform. And this is what Wilson says. Brother Bailey has a uniform. Any creeping, crawling yellow cur could get into a uniform and hold a rifle. But it takes guts to go into a conscientious objectors camp.
Right.
So it's not the whole story about Phyllis being forced to go back to conjugal services for Lawrence. That doesn't upset anybody. But this slur against the military is enough to rile up like 100 to 300 people to go and protest at the church over a couple of days. Throwing stones on the ceiling, about 6 or 7 guys saying, oh, we are veterans. They went and interrupted allegedly a baptism and tried to pull Frank Wilson off the pulpit. Pretty violent stuff. But it seems that somehow Wilson was able to, at least if not completely apologize, smooth the waters a little bit with the RSA by saying, hey, look, I was in the military in World War I. All of our able-bodied members did go and fight in World War II. So how deeply he actually believed in being a conscientious objector or encouraged his members to be conscientious objectors, not clear. But potentially, since this caused such an uproar amongst the public, and because the appeals were in the news, maybe it wasn't a common thing. So it's an unusual comment that people weren't expecting from that church. There are a couple of pieces of news of people trying to avoid military service, getting their appeals dismissed. That is it. Around 1950 is the last time we see Commonwealth Covenant Church mentioned in the paper's past archive. Though a bit of searching on Ancestry.com, I think I found a funeral listing for Frank Wilson, and it looks like he may have died in 1949 and is buried in Palmerston North. There's nothing in New Zealand news that I can find about the church until about 2016. And at that point, that's when a lot of the children who grew up in the 90s came through on stop.co.nz and discussed one child had been sexually abused by a senior member of the church. It wasn't unusual for children to be removed from their families and just put with another family in another part of New Zealand for a year or more. It was a common practice. We also hear a bit more about excommunication. If you left the church, you were excommunicated. For some of these families, it was at least a couple of generations when you consider a church starting in, let's say, 1930s. So we see a lot of those issues reported with the exclusive brethren, JWs, and so on. There's a really interesting connection with the Assemblies of God. So this happened sort of back in the 1960s. For some reason, the Commonwealth Covenant Church, they moved out of the building. I think I have an idea about what building it is. I'm not 100% sure. The building had been bought by the city council because they were going to try to widen the road for some reason, but they ended up giving up on that plan and were looking for someone to buy it. Guess who tried to buy it?
Well, I've read the article, so I know.
It was Frank Houston. Now, if that name rings a bell for any of our listeners, Frank Houston is the founder of Hillsong. But at the time, he was ex-Salvation Army, and he was then with the Assemblies of God, trying to grow their Lower Hutt church. So this was a bit of a wheel and deal. At that time, they did have quite a few members from the Commonwealth Covenant Church who had been burned, in a sense, by that church. They had been excommunicated. So he was kind of aware that, we need this building for our growing congregation, but we also have these members of the board who might be a little bit sensitive about it. So he was able to get keys to go take a look at the place. The ex-members of the Commonwealth Covenant Church were absolutely, apparently over the moon to get their old building back. And somehow Frank was able to convince the Hutt City Council at the time that he had the money or that he would be able to pay them back. He didn't actually have the cash. He had some of the cash, but not all of it. No one was keeping track. The council let them move in and buy furniture and all this stuff. And by the time anyone realized that Frank actually could not afford the building, the city council had to keep their trap shut because it was either A, the public was going to be upset because this went through, or B, okay, you're evicting a really popular church. And then that's going to upset a lot of people. So they were between a rock and a hard place, the poor Hutt City Council.
Not surprising that a group of Christians would be duplicitous and use this kind of trickery to pay less than they promised for a building.
Indeed. So we haven't really heard anything about this cult since. As I said, it kind of died out after one of their main leaders, Stanley Watkins, took over after Frank Wilson. When Watkins died, there was a bit of an overhaul of the church. A lot of families left, which is always a big impetus to change. Somehow it changed both its direction and its doctrines and has now become the Hope Center. We see the Hope Center quite a bit, particularly in the Hutt. They have churches in Poirua. I think they have one in Johnsonville. There's one in the Hutt. This is Paul Sanders' church. I think we've met Paul Sanders a few times at Prayers for Parliament.
Right.
So there's no evidence that the Hope Center actually has any of the same original doctrines that Wilson and A.J. Ferris had in the beginning. No evidence for that. And other people who have commented on this have made the same conclusions. The question that always comes up is, okay, was this a cult? The person the media tends to go to is Peter Lanahan. Dr. Lanahan always has a very conservative, reluctant view on things. He would say no, and also because it's now a defunct sect, it's difficult to set blame. Is there any point to blame anyone? And it's not about blame. It's about, we have this generation of children who are now adults who are seeking a little bit of justice, a little bit of acknowledgement of what happened that was messed up in their isolated childhoods.
Peter also has his own fervent religious belief as well, as far as I understand, which might colour his opinion somewhat.
I think definitely in the eyes of the children, if you look into the 2016 articles, they're very comfortable with saying this was a cult. We were very, very isolated, no TV, no radio, segregation of boys and girls.
They're happy to say it was a cult.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple of points before we end tonight's episode. We're putting a link into the show notes for a petition. Dr. Simon Kemp, professor at the University of Canterbury, is petitioning the government to broaden journal access so that the members of the public are able to have improved access to knowledge. So if that's something that you think is a thumbs up for you, please follow the link in the show notes and add your name. Johnny Grady is hard at work putting together the conference. Does anyone in Christchurch, where our conference will be held this year, wants to raise their hand to assist Johnny in organizing the conference or to be a speaker, please reach out. Write us at committee@skeptics.nz. And also, we also want to try to get ahead of our awards. So the Bent Spoon, Skeptic of the Year. Please email us with your nominations as you see fit, as you come across interesting news articles or radio bits. And again, you can also email us at committee@skeptics.nz. So for the regular membership corner, we have the next Skeptics in Cyberspace on May 21st. The link is always, again, in the show notes on our Facebook page and on our various meetup groups. In Wellington, we will have Skeptical Activism in the Pub on Thursday, May 22nd. Mark, do you want to indulge us with your spiel?
Very short one this week. Come along, complain, get a free beer. Love to see you there. Wellington, 6 o'clock, Thursday, Fork and Brewer.
Awesome. And then we will have the usual Skeptics in the Pub in Wellington on May 30th at the Intercontinental Hotel on 2 Grey Street. Come in at 6 p.m., meet the lovely group of skeptics. The next Auckland Skeptics in the Pub will be on Tuesday, June 3rd at the Dyson Fork. That starts at 6:30 p.m. Dunedin Skeptics in the Pub continues to be on hiatus, so we are waiting with bated breath when they start meeting again. And for those in Christchurch, there may be a special event, not a skeptical event, but skeptical adjacent. On June 13th at the restaurant Child Sister from 6 p.m. is the Fund and Film Night. Join the Decult team as they release their short documentary on the conference and hear from various conference speakers, such as myself, as we give updates on what has happened in our various corners of the cultosphere since October 2024. Tickets are $10. Go to decult.net and check the events page there for more info. Well, I think that is it for the notices. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, or kudos, please email us at either podcast@skeptics.nz or newsletter@skeptics.nz. Well, that's it for the Yeah Nah podcast. We hope that we will see you next fortnight. Ka kite.
Akite.
Bye.